Welcome to Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Centre for Policy Research. My name's Tim Wilson. I'm a senior fellow at the London Centre. This Thought to Action is brought to you on the Second Amendment and a variety of issues around it. With me today, our President, retired Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, our distinguished fellow, retired Navy Captain Pete O'Brien, and Marine, good guy and senior fellow at the London Centre, Bill Heinzelman. My name is Tim Wilson, as I said, and we are available on all the usual things, YouTube, Thought to Action. We're also on, if you like what we do, please like, ring the bell, subscribe and follow us on YouTube. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, Getter, you name it, we're on it. And if you really like what we do, please follow us on patreon.com/thoughttoaction. That would help us out enormously. Today, we're going to talk about myths and the Second Amendment. And I'd like to start off with myth number one, which is that the US is a uniquely violent place with guns all over the shop and mass murder occurring on a regular basis. That myth has a very strange historical background, and I'd like to start off by saying just a little thing myself about the Wild West and how Hollywood and the media have created an image of America that is just fake. Bottom line is that if you look at the history of the Wild West, the Hollywood shootout in the streets is just not true. The amount of violence in the Wild West is grossly exaggerated in many, many ways. And as one example of that, I will just say that throughout the entire bad years of the genuine Wild West, there were probably no more than 45 famous murders across the entire place. And in Tombstone, for example, in the year of the OK Corral, there were 4 murders or 4 violent deaths took place in Tombstone. All 4 of those were directly related to the gunfight at the OK Corral. So on that note, a number of others here to comment, and the image that the media portrays of this terribly violent country. Tony, your thoughts?
Someone who's had kind of a foot in both fields, both camps, I guess is a better word. I've seen what the reality is regarding the issues of violence versus gun violence and how Hollywood and others have portrayed it. There's a real denial, I think, about the fact that that a gun is technology. I mean, if I may. This is a loaded gun. It's safe. I'm not doing anything with it for YouTube, just in case. I'm not doing anything to break it down or show how it works. I'm just stating a fact that this is technology. It is no more dangerous than a car at any given time by the fact that a car, if not in motion, it sits there. It does nothing. This is going to sit here in my office. And I'm putting it away safely into a holster and do nothing. So the idea that a gun is violent, I just disprove it. That's not a violent gun. Can the gun do violence? Well, of course it can, by the fact that someone like me has to pick it up and use it. And this is what drives me nuts about Hollywood. Hollywood makes money off of this technology. This technology is what's made a number of big names and big stars in these action adventures, which have no relation to reality. So the duplicity of their message is astounding. That any given day, if you go on Amazon, you go on Netflix, you have all of these anti-gun nuts using the very technology to make their money, and it's just wrong. Then you combine this, I would argue that Hollywood has made people numb to the violence, that it's not the gun, it's the violence, that they have, through this violence porn, over and over and over, just made people numb to the idea that we need to be concerned about how things are reflected in our society, because certain cities have now just completely lost track or interest in protecting its citizens. Los Angeles, the sheriff there has been told by his woke overlords that he cannot prevent the firing of all these deputies, despite the fact there's a 95% increase in violent crime in the city. They want to have him fire a great portion of his sheriffs over something that has proven to not be effective, this vaccine thing. So they could care less about the violence. But it's not, again, in LA, it's not the guns. The guns aren't out shooting people. It's criminals. And they're refusing to accept the fact that violent criminals are the ones out causing the violence, not the gun. So that's one example. Chicago, a poor child, a 15-year-old was shot 24 times just going to the store. Yet they're not focused on the violence, they're focused on the gun. Oh, this is gun violence. No, it's violence. And again, people have become so detached from the idea that violence needs to be the focus, I would argue, because of Hollywood, because of this imagery, this popular imagery that everything, that violence is acceptable. So I think it's a long-winded way of trying to answer your question, Tim, but I think the very fabric of the discussion needs to be reframed to the fact that it's not guns. Even in the West, when the West was won, the idea that a good man with a gun was the only solution to a bad man with a gun. It's about force on force. And I think we have to reframe it into the context of individuals with the proper technology can prevent bad individuals with the technology from doing bad things. And I think that's a large burden that is on our team and on the overall pro-Second Amendment or pro-Bill of Rights movement right now. So I think that's what we have to look at.
That leads nicely, actually, in some ways, as a segue to Bill. You're a Marine, and you know about the scientific application of violence, as it were. Do you think America is inherently a violent nation?
Absolutely not. I think Americans are very charitable and kind, and it all has to do with our prosperity. And some of that prosperity stems from the violence that good, benevolent, morally just folks were willing to do to, uphold our freedom and our way of life. But so no, I don't think America is inherently violent. I think we're the opposite of that. I think we're very against violence. We try to avoid violence. Everywhere we go, we're trying to. I think most Americans really abhor it. We don't want anything to do with violence.
Would you like to talk about on operations and hearts and minds aspects and how much effort that gets compared with direct conflict with the enemy?
Right. Yeah. So you mean like as far as coverage and media coverage goes?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I want to talk about Hollywood. That's what I want to talk about. But so to your point about Hollywood and the Wild West, Little House on the Prairie isn't on TV anymore, right? That is not going to sell commercials, advertising slots anymore, right? So Americans are drifting from a place of common sense, I think. Common sense is fleeting. And we got to get back to common sense. So, my advice to Americans is when you're consuming media, when you're consuming information, just differentiate when you're consuming media and information, are you doing it to be educated, to learn something, or are you doing it to be entertained? And if you're doing it to be entertained, really just enjoy it through that filter and don't try to have some sort of preconceived, like don't try to learn something from it necessarily, and stop yourself from creating your own personal biases around a thing if you're consuming information for entertainment purposes, right? You don't watch cartoons, you don't watch Popeye and hope to learn about the Navy, right? I don't know, Pete, what do you think? Nobody's going to watch Popeye.
In some cases, you might, though.
Sure, right. You're not going to watch Popeye and figure out how to eat a better diet and grow muscles, right? Like that's not, you're just getting entertained by Popeye, right? So that's kind of the point I'd like to make about Hollywood is don't expect to get knowledge from something that's entertainment.
That's a very good point. Pete,
If I can jump in there on that.
Except for anything with Steven Seagal. That's the exception.
But it's an interesting thing. I was working out the other day and had a movie on just to create some background noise while I was working out. And I don't remember the movie, but there was a shootout in the middle of the movie. It wasn't even the culminating shootout. It was just a shootout. And in the shootout, something like eight policemen were shot. Now, if 8 policemen got shot in a shootout in some city in the United States today, it would be, the city would go into lockdown and it would be the front page above the fold event on every major newspaper in the country. And yet in the movies, these kind of things happen with amazing regularity. And they need to be, to Bill's point is, it's entertainment. It's a movie. Don't draw conclusions and don't let it affect your perception on what a society is really like. It's not like that. It doesn't, that kind of thing doesn't happen. And I have some numbers here, and we're sort of out of sequence what we were talking about earlier, but I have some numbers here about guns in a society. Guns number, and this is number of weapons per 100 people in the society. The United States is far and away the most weapons in a society. We are the only nation with more than one weapon on average per person. We have 120 weapons in this country per person is the assessed average. That number, in fact, may be low. And at the same time, we have 4.5 murders, a murder rate of 4.5 per 100,000. So let's look at some other countries around the world, because if the argument is correct, that guns foster an environment of violence and crime, then we should in fact have the highest crime rate in the world. And that countries with low numbers of weapons would have lower crime rates. So let's look at some relative places. Brazil has 8.3 weapons per person or per 100. So roughly 1/15 the number of weapons as the United States. Brazil has 23 murders per 100,000 people. So a murder rate 5 times higher than the United States. Jamaica, beautiful Jamaica, beautiful place. 8.8 firearms per 100. So again, about a difference of 15 to 1. The United States has more weapons. Their murder rate is 9 times the United States murder rate, 38 murders per person, per 100,000. Canada has 1/3 the number of weapons in the United States, 34.7 per 100, per 100. They have a 0.5 murders per 100,000. So what you're really looking at here is not the presence or absence of weapons. What you're looking at are cultural influences. And I'll give you 2 more examples. Japan, which is if you've ever been to Japan, wonderful place, love the Japanese. They are very Japanese. And if you've ever been to Japan, you know what I mean, but they're different. They have a different culture. They have a different way of looking at the world. And they really do view each other as part of this huge extended family. The result is that while they also have they're 219th on the list worldwide. with 0.3 weapons per 100, or 3 privately owned weapons per 1,000 people. They have 0.01 murders per 100,000 people. It's a phenomenally low murder rate. And yet, if you look at a couple of other countries, another country with a low number of firearms, 2.4 firearms per 100, you would think they would have a very low murder rate. That's the Congo. The Congo, since 1992, has had 5 million people killed violently in this ongoing series of insurgencies, civil war, and just rampant violence in small towns. And they are essentially unarmed. So there are essentially, if you actually open the aperture and look at the world, there is no statistical significance that ties murder rates and gun ownership rates. And it's all over the place. It's all over the world.
If I may then move us along a little bit, that leads in its way nicely as well. Americans are uniquely placed. As you say, there's about 120 guns per 100 people. The only country in the world with more than 1 gun per person on average. This all stems from the Second Amendment. And the myth that I'd like to talk about now is that the Second Amendment does not guarantee the individual right to bear arms and only applies it to a well-regulated militia. And a corollary to that, or something that some of the gun control people try and follow, is that, and that would only apply to muskets. Nobody should have modern firearms.
The language of the Second Amendment, I think, is clearly defined for the purposes of the combination of the individual and the collective right. The individual right is, I believe, a God-given right to defend yourself, period. As I mentioned, technology, it just so happens that today's technology is different than the musket, but the concept is the same. You as the individual should have the right, the uninfringed right, to be able to protect yourself. Now, can you defend yourself? Can you kill someone like John Wick with a pen or a pencil? Does that make this a weapon that you should require people to register or prevent them from having? Because I'm pretty sure I could kill someone with this pen. Just saying. So the technology is irrelevant. There's no reason to ever list a technology. I find, and Tim, I don't know if you agree with me on this, but the idea that the state of California has actually listed out what weapons you're allowed to have. Last time I checked, a 15-round P226 will kill you as dead as a 10-round P226. It matters not. It matters not the amount of pull in the trigger, if it has a safety on the weapon. It doesn't matter. The bullet itself will kill you. You know, I've got a couple of bullets. Boy, you guys, you ought to hang up my office sometime. I've got a bullet right here. And this is a 45 caliber hollow point. It doesn't matter what gun you use this in. It's going to have the same basic effect. It's a hollow point. It's going to pancake theoretically on impact, unless it hits bone or something, it shatters. And it's designed to stop you. That's it. It's not emotional. It's technology. So the founding fathers did not say muskets, you are authorized to keep your musket under all conditions. They didn't say that. They said you have the right of self-defense. That's what it's focused on. That right of self-defense, the idea that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, is linked then to the collective issue. Because I think more than ever, when we first began this project, I would have never have believed that we would be in a position today to be commenting on the need to have a collective citizenry arm until I saw what happened in Australia and what's happening in Canada as we speak. The moment you give up your individual right, you lose the collective capacity to defend yourself. And that's where tyranny comes in. I don't believe for a minute that Australia would be able to send people to concentration camps if they had armed citizens who could organize and push back against the government. I just don't think it would be happening. And when you see here in this country, the constant effort by Joe Biden and others to say, oh, we're not anti-Second Amendment, we just don't want weapons of war on the street. There's no such thing as weapons of war. There's just weapons. And weapons are legitimately available to citizens for defense, period. That's it. There should be no parsing of those words.
Yep.
I know people, and I've known people, you know, I've read history. There's no history of the federal government banning cannons. I think you can legitimately own a cannon right now. I know people who do. And truth be told, you can own an automatic weapon. Nobody says you can't own it. You just have to pay a lot of money and get a license to do it. So even when they say that you know, these weapons are banned, they're not really banned. They're just hard to get and expensive. And criminals are lazy. They're not going to spend $24,000 to get a weapon that they're going to use once and go to jail because they're probably going to get caught. You use automatic weapons, I think it tends to get people's attention.
Yep.
So I just don't think it's a viable argument by the left, but it's an emotional argument. It's an emotional one because, ooh, we don't want to have weapons of war on our street. Let me tell you something. Chicago is a war zone, and there's not a single weapon of war on it at this point. It's all about violence. Violence is the issue, not the type or manner, not the type of weapon or the manner of its use. So
Those that make these arguments ignore the history of what went on around the time of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution being written. I will just point out that there is one classic example. They always talk about, when they start on this argument, about the fact that the Bill of Rights says a well-regulated militia, blah, blah. If you look at the discussions that went on at the time of the writing of the Constitution and the Bill of Arms and the Bill of Rights, one of the clear things that comes across, if you read the Constitution of the state of Pennsylvania at the time, it says, and I quote, that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. It does not say anything about a militia. Why would that be that they accepted it? Would it be because the founding fathers thought that a militia was just what every able-bodied adult would do in defense of themselves and the country? I think it is. I think that this business about you have to be in a militia in order to have a gun and the right to bear arms is rubbish. And I think your point about cannon is a good one. Pete, you and I have talked about this. Would you like to just talk about what type of weapons were available back then and how it applies today?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing too, particularly if you go and look at the start of this this revolution that we fought in started in 1775. One of my favorite poems, you know, here the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The battles of Lexington and Concord, those were farmers who showed up with squirrel rifles because that's what they had, and managed to break up the British formation, protect their ammunition holdings, and basically harassed the British troops, who were, by the way, good troops. Those were good guys who had engaged in Indian fighting in the territories out in western New York. Now those were squared away troops who knew how to do broken field running, if you will, and they were harassed back into Boston. And then the same rebels, courtesy of a bookseller named Knox, who became the first Secretary of War, went and recovered cannon, dragged those cannon into Boston, and the British left. So that the idea here that this is not about war fighting, and this is about protecting yourself at home, etc. No, none of that is true. This is about the ability to do exactly what they had done before, which is the ability to protect themselves from an oppressive dictatorial government. That's what the whole point was. And the weapons, when they talk about the right to bear arms, they're talking about weapons necessary to throw out a dictatorial government. And it's worth noting, as far as people who say, oh, there's going to be horrible breakout in crime. I would just ask anybody to tell me when a crime has been committed in the United States that used, let's say, a B-17 or an F-86 or an F-4 Phantom that used an M24. What's a Sherman tank? M4 Sherman tank. People own tanks. People own armored personnel carriers. People own retired aircraft, weapons of war. People own machine guns, as Tony points out. There are people who own artillery pieces. I don't recall any of them having been used in any kind of criminal effort in the last 50 years. So the idea that somehow these extreme weapons are going to cause the end of society as we know it is kind of ludicrous. And I would only add one final thing here is that one of the things that they always talk about is how horrible the AR-15s are. I'd go back to Tony's pen. More people died from being clubbed to death and knifed to death last year in the United States than were killed by any kind of long weapon. AR-15s, hunting rifles, shotguns, all added together, more people were beaten to death or strangled or clubbed to death or knifed to death than were killed by rifles. So,
which makes Home Depot more dangerous than a gun store.
Exactly.
Absolutely right. Bill, do you want to add anything to this bit?
Yeah, if the folks that are making that argument about muskets, and militias, I would wonder, and you guys know a lot more about this than me, but are they the same folks that are, they're against originalism, right? Very likely. So
Yep.
There's a massive inconsistency of how they're interpreting the Bill of Rights and the Constitution here. And somebody needs to pull that card out, I think, because you can't have it both ways, right? You can't, be an originalist and a living constitutionalism person, right? I mean, I guess you can, and that's what we probably see a lot of that, right?
Didn't George Orwell cover something along those lines? Something about jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but non-available today.
Well, let me hit that point where you guys are both bringing it up. So language is a big part of this. So one of the things that Orwell was very big on is the idea of rewriting the past. You basically can basically control the past, controls the future. And that's what we see here. So I'm going to say something that I hope doesn't get us in trouble with YouTube, but it's fact. What is the origins of the word assault rifle? Does anybody know what that is? I think you all know what it is. You don't want to say. So the assault rifle came from 1944, and Hitler seeing something called Gewehr, STG 44, STG 43, which was the first rifle or assault rifle. That's the translation. So I find it interesting that the left has picked up a Nazi term and adopted it for their own to facilitate their view that they need to go after essentially weapons that Hitler had named. I find it's interesting that the left is happy to use the assault rifle imagery that was created by a Nazi madman during World War II. Just saying.
I'd very much like to ask Bill, I mean, as a Marine, do you think a hunting AR is an assault weapon?
I hunt with an AR, it's just more fun, right? It's more fun. It's like Tony's point, to reiterate, it's a tool, right? I hunt with a bow more often than I hunt with a gun, right? There's not a lot of, I don't know how many murders there are with bows and arrows, but there are a lot of deer taken in the woods with a bow and arrow, right? It's a deadly weapon if people choose to use it that way. Just like people are throwing people in front of trains, inanimate objects don't make people violent. People tend to make people violent, I think.
If I may, I'll take that forward. There's another myth that says that the 1994 gun ban which expired in 2004, didn't work because it wasn't strong enough. It should have expanded to not just their version of assault weapons, but to many more, potentially every type of, I don't know what they want to achieve, a total gun ban or something, but they say that it didn't work because it, as I say, it wasn't strong enough. I don't know how much stronger they could make it. The bottom line is, just so you're aware of what we're talking about here, in 1994, Congress imposed a ban on assault weapons. Rifle violence actually increased after that ban.
Right.
And
Exactly, of course.
and did not be, and then when it expired, that law expired in 2004, and again, assault rifles were available to the public, the AR-15 for hunting in particular. The murder rate with rifles went back down again. So, you know, this term assault weapon to me is a complete misnomer. As you guys are rightly saying, there are deadly weapons. There are deadly weapons called stones. David took down Goliath with a stone. What are we going to do? Ban rocks? That isn't going to work. There are violent people, and then there are tools. And the gun is.
But Tim, to that point, the violent people are not the ones the laws affect. They only affect the law abiding.
Well, that's the next one on the myths we want to cover, Tony.
Can I jump in something though before you go there, Tim? I would add a thought on the idea of the completely disarmed society, and the question of whether you will achieve some sort of pastoral peace. And my reference is a little country in Southeast Asia that I had opportunity to visit several times while in the Navy, the country of East Timor. East Timor was a part of Indonesia. East Timor is strongly Catholic, 98% Catholic, I believe, while Indonesia is mostly Muslim. They had a long-running, burning grind as the Indonesian government tried to control and suppress, really, the Catholicism there. And it ended up with a slow burn that erupted in the end of the 90s. And the country of East Timor is about the size of Connecticut, had about 1.5 million people, something like that, 1.3 to 1.5 million. Records are hard to come by, and you'll know why in a second. And the Indonesians army went in there and killed somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 people in very short order. And then proceeded, the reason why we don't have hard numbers, they then proceeded to burn 98% of the buildings in the country. They burned every single piece of paper they could find. No deeds, no birth certificates, no death certificates, nothing. All that gone. How many people here? We don't know. Where's the property line? We don't know. Everything was gone. The key point here, and relative to our discussion, is this. East Timor was, I believe, 223rd on the list of firearms per person. It was 0.1 or 0.3 per 100. They were unarmed in essence. And the Indonesian army could do whatever the heck it wanted to do because they were unarmed. And there's that lesson is so glaringly obvious. I'll repeat it. They were unarmed, just like the people in China are unarmed.
That leads nicely onto the next myth. Bill, I'm going to ask you to comment on this, and that is the myth that gun-free zones prevent gun violence.
Right. I was in high school when we first started seeing school shootings happen. And it seems like every active shooter scenario, I think I have a statistic here. I think it's 94%. Somebody can fact check me on this and get some fact check me. 94% of active shooter events happen in gun-free zones.
Yep.
Criminals don't care about gun laws, right? They don't care about your gun-free zone sign. right? So, you know, all you're doing is keeping the guns, the tool, out of those who would be benevolent and take, you know, a just action with that tool.
You could almost say, Bill, that the criminals do pay attention to the the gun laws. They focus on where there are no guns.
That's right. Yeah.
We actually know that's true from investigation of a couple of the mass shooters, in particular, the cinema shooter. They went through his diaries and everything else. He had carefully researched where to go to make sure that where he went was a gun-free zone.
Mhm. Because nobody's going to shoot back at him.
Correct. They may be insane, but they're not suicidal as such very often.
So the other one is, somebody can fact check this. You know, you talk about the, you know, major urban centers that have the strictest gun laws, and look in those murder rates. I saw somewhere as 25% of all murders, that all homicides that happen with a firearm are in 4 cities, and they are Baltimore, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. 25% of all homicides with firearms across the country in 4 cities. And they are known for having the strictest gun laws of urban centers around the country.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an impactful
solution,
statistic.
the solution that our politicians constantly, some of them, come up with is to confiscate guns. There is a myth that, and I quote, nobody is demanding the confiscation of guns. It does seem to me that there are people demanding the confiscation of guns.
What I find ironic, I've said this before, I go armed a lot of the time, but the thing is this, the places I can go armed, I don't really feel I need to. The places which are most prohibitive for a legal gun owner to carry are the cities that Bill just mentioned. When I'm in those cities, I want to be armed, but then technically you can't be armed because it's a gun-free zone, or the limitations are such that you have to go through you have to know who to bribe in New York to get a gun. I mean, let's be honest here. You got to bribe someone to get a gun. How is that constitutional? I don't know, but you got to know someone to bribe. DC is not much better. You can only, and by the way, I don't know if you all knew this, you're restricted to 20 rounds. And if they see you printing when you're concealed carrying, they'll arrest you because, rights. So it's ironic that the places where the most gun violence occurs has the most restrictive gun laws, but the most restrictive gun laws only affect law-abiding citizens. It has zero effect to stop criminals. As a matter of fact, I would argue it's an enhancement and draw for criminal behavior.
When you talk about law-abiding citizens carrying weapons, it's important to remember that law-abiding citizens carrying weapons act as a very real deterrent to thousands of crimes every week around the nation, that thousands and thousands of crimes are not committed.
Thousands every day.
Thousands every day, right. Because there are law-abiding citizens walking around with weapons. And this idea that somehow, well, if we let Tony go into Baltimore with his pistol, it's going to be the end of the world. No, if we let Tony and another, 15,000 folks walk into Baltimore legally carrying pistols, the crime rate is in fact going to go down. It's simply that simple.
Well, a quick point on that. So I was actually in a big box store. I won't mention which it was because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. And one of the guys at the checkout recognized me. And he said, first off, thank you for your service. And I always appreciate that. He said, you're armed, aren't you? I said, yes, I am. He says, well, I just want to let you know, Colonel, I feel better knowing that you're here armed because, we are always worried about something going wrong and being a target. So people like you being here, we appreciate it. Just saying.
And I would say to your comment, to your question about America and Americans, Tim, at the beginning, that's the sentiment of most Americans, I would say.
Exactly.
When they meet a veteran, when they meet somebody who's benevolent and there's like sort of an instant trust established, they feel better, they feel safer.
Bill, you raise a point that I want to push on with a little bit more, which is you're going to face at some stage. The rest of us are old and have faced it. Retirement comes along, and we're all trained in using weapons. And I have a concealed carry permit from the state of New York, but like Tony, because the rules are different, I can't carry in the highest crime area of New York State, otherwise known as Manhattan. You are a Marine, you know how to use a weapon properly and safely. We're all trained that way. And yet the restrictions, once you retire, will increase on when and where you can carry. Do you believe that's right? Or are you going to carry on protecting your community to the best of your ability when you retire?
I wholeheartedly believe in neighbors taking care of neighbors, right? So it's something that I'm going to argue for forever, right? Yeah. People just neighbors taking care of neighbors, keeping it local, taking care of your communities. We don't need more restrictions. We don't need more regulations coming down, sweeping regulations, hidden regulations.
But surely the criminals will follow those regulations.
Right, that's exactly right. It is the more weapons you take out of good people's hands, and that's the thing, is a law-abiding citizen will comply with the law, right? If there's a law that diminishes my freedom to carry, right? If there's some regulation that reduces my ability to carry, that I'm going to comply to it. I'm going to comply. Right? What does that leave me with? My favorite weapon system of all, my bare hands, right? But, I'm still going to look out for my neighbors, and it just makes me less able to look out for my neighbors. It makes me less capable in a moment of crisis. Yeah. To reduce unnecessary violence, right?
Yep. If I may, gentlemen, it's time to wrap it up. But the final myth that I would like us all to comment on would be the one that guns are not fun. Run with it, guys.
That's coming from somebody who's never fired a gun, right? A lot of folks out there who are completely unfamiliar. They only know what they're hearing from whatever media outlets whatever media they're consuming. And they haven't given it a try. So I would encourage anyone who has that bias without trying it. It's like shrimp. They taste good, try it, right?
I would bet that we've all had the experience of introducing somebody who was anti-gun to shooting. I went on a trip, I will say, to Israel with a group of very liberal professors and college students, and the IDF very kindly hosted a day on the range. Every single one of those people shot and then had their photograph taken with a big grin on their face.
Of course.
Safety is vital, sure, but guns are fun.
Well, speaking of shrimp, Jeffrey Toobin and his tubination stuff, there's always the accusation. You know where I'm going with this. There's always the accusation that the technology takes the place of, tubing, but I don't think it's true. I don't. As a matter of fact, I think it's the liberal, the men on the left, who I think lack any courage to pick up and use a weapon, because a weapon, I think, indicates one's understanding of, again, technology. It's technology. It's not an extension of a person's persona. Although once you're into it, you can, do all sorts of accessorization. I mean, I'm not lying to you. There's all sorts of holsters you can get, and you can get weapons to match your thing. It is actually something of a hobby for a lot of folks, because you can just buy a single weapon.
Mm-hmm.
360 here, 365 that I carry. It's a basic technology. You can go fancy, but the idea is it is fun to actually learn about this. Like cars, People get into cars, people get into stamps. This is another area that I think is deep in history. Boy, you know, I've learned a lot about Garand and the M1. There's a fascinating history there about, and by the way, there's all sorts of politics behind this. The story of the Thompson submachine gun, of how that was created after World War I and all the politics that went through. So to me, as a historian, I'm not a historian, but I'm a student of history. It's fascinating just to learn about some of this stuff, about how things are developed and refined over years. So it is fun. I think it's something legitimately available for people to learn about, to actually engage in. And again, you know, it's not the technology. This is not going to go off. This is ambivalent to the user. It will not do good or bad. It simply is technology that is available to individuals to have fun with, and it is fun to shoot. So you know.
And if I can jump in there, to everybody out there who has either never fired a pistol or rifle, or has done very little of it, is not really quite sure, I would encourage you to go to one of these ranges and look into some of the opportunities that they have. There are, for example, defensive pistol competitions for beginners, which and I remember taking some friends to one and just letting them you know, go through the games, and they were giddy at the end of it. They were so happy. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. I would also add things like skeet shooting. If you've never gone skeet shooting,
Yeah, that's a blast.
and, you know, there's never been a time when I've gone skeet shooting when I haven't walked off the range. It just, you know, my face hurts because I'm smiling so much, because it's just fun to go bust some clays. It is.
It's not from the buckshot.
and you know, you take a little kid out, give him a BB gun, show him how to shoot it, and watch him or her have fun. It will amaze you how much fun they can have. And they're nowhere near it. They're nowhere near their little game console. They're doing real stuff out in the woods. It's a blast.
And let me hit that real quick. So to Pete's point, it teaches responsibility to the younger as well. When I was 13, I was given a bolt action 22 rifle on a farm in upstate New York near Cuba, New York, and go have fun. I didn't shoot anything I wasn't supposed to. I set up targets and I actually started just figuring it out. They gave me like 100 rounds and go have fun. It was fun. So yeah, so it's kind of like, you know, it was fun.
Can I just get
One thing, if I could, real quick.
Go ahead.
One myth that relates very closely to this is that there is like the typical gun owner, right? We are a very remarkably diverse country here, right? And that goes right along with gun owners. There's no such thing as a typical gun owner. You might be thinking like Bill's the typical gun owner, but there is no such thing as that. So go to a range and see the typical gun owner. It's soccer moms and grandpas and grandkids, and it's
People
everybody in between.
of every race, nation, creed, and color.
Mhm.
Bankers and priests and teachers and lawyers, and they're all there. They're all
Everybody, doctors and everybody.
A very American activity. Can I just wrap this up by saying, I think a lot of the people that are anti, it is from fear. That fear comes from not understanding. If you do take the time, as all of us are encouraging you to do, you will end up being surprised and having fun, and you will lose the fear because you will learn about safety. As Tony has said over and over, a gun is a tool. It is no more dangerous than any other tool. It is the user that is dangerous. There are dangerous habits. There are dangerous people. Go and learn how to use a gun safely. A lot of that fear will go away. On that note, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. This has been a fun one to do. Tony Shaffer, our president, Pete O'Brien, our distinguished fellow, Bill Heinzelman, our senior fellow, And I'm Tim Wilson for the Herb London Centre for Policy Research. This has been Thought to Action. If you like what we've done, if you like what we do, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please ring the bell saying that you like what we do, and follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Rumble, and please help us out if you can. Go to patreon.com/thoughttoaction and subscribe to us there. You'll get previews, you'll get some stuff that is unique to that channel, and a lot more detail. Plus, we will answer any questions we can from you. Thank you very much for watching.